My name is Mandy, and I am always so happy to have y'all here. So today I really want to talk about something that is often very confusing for people, especially when they're first starting out in the sourdough world, on their sourdough journey. So of course it involves the beloved sourdough starter, because that seems to be kind of the biggest struggle for most people, including myself when I first started. That along with bulk fermentation, which is another video I plan to work on soon, so watch out for that. But I want to talk about sourdough starter feeding ratios. So whenever I am teaching a sourdough class, a lot of people look at me like a deer in the headlights whenever I bring up sourdough starter feeding ratios. And I think a lot of that is because whenever people hear numbers, they get a little overwhelmed and perhaps intimidated. I know I do. I was never a big math person. I've never been a big math person. So feeding ratios can seem a little bit daunting at first, but I promise if I can figure it out, you can too. I, again, am really, really terrible at math. So I promise you got this. I hope to explain it in a way that is a little more helpful for you, maybe not quite as intimidating. So let's get started. So this is my beloved sourdough starter row. She was named after my grandmother, Rommel, and I have had my starter for almost 2 years now, and I made it on my own from scratch, which was very exciting, and it's doing fantastic, as you can see. I don't usually keep this much starter in a jar at once, but tomorrow's my big baking day in my bakery, so I had to feed it quite a big ratio last night to get it up to this point. So you can see here that I fed it last night. This is the line that it started at after I had fed it. I fed it last night a 1:5:5 ratio. So it's been sitting like this since about 8 p.m. last night. It is now almost 9 o'clock here, so it's a little cooler here, so it is taking it a little bit longer to rise, and also with that higher ratio, it typically will take longer. So what a sourdough starter feeding ratio is the amount of flour and water you are giving your sourdough starter at once. So when you feed it, you have to feed it a certain ratio. So for example, if you feed your sourdough starter a 1:1:1 ratio, that first number is the amount of starter that you're putting in, and the second two numbers are the amount of flour and the amount of water that you put into the jar to feed your starter. So a lot of people will use a little bit less water to feed their starter, and that's going to get you what is called a stiff sourdough starter. I personally have found that my starter does best when I feed it equal parts of flour and water. So for example, the 1:1:1 ratio, say you are going to do the 1:1:1 ratio, all you would do is do 25 grams of starter, for example, and then 25 grams flour, 25 grams of water. So the 1:1:1 is equal everything. And then say you do 1:2:2, you're just going to double the amount of flour and double the amount of water. So for example, with that same number, the 25 grams of sourdough starter, you're gonna do 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. Again, I always use equal amounts of flour and water. So a lot of people like to always use the 1:1:1 ratio. Doug Baxter has decided to join us. He is very interested in learning about sourdough starter feeding ratios. So what I was saying is that the 1:1:1 ratio is very common. I know a lot of bakers that use that ratio a lot. I personally don't always use a 1:1:1 ratio. And that is because a 1:1:1 ratio is going to make your starter ferment quicker. So what I like to tell people in my classes is that, say that your sourdough starter is like little tiny people and they're really hungry. So when you feed it, they're in your jar and they're going through all that food. If you have a low ratio, like a 1:1:1, they're gonna get through that food very quickly. So once they get through that food, your starter is going to start to deflate and it's going to start to build a lot of lactic acid. Keep in mind that the smaller ratio is going to ferment quicker, but it's also going to deflate quicker. So you can use that to your advantage if you need your starter to ferment quicker. But the reason I don't always like to do that is because it starts to create a lot of lactic acid flavor and buildup. If you feed it the 1:1:1 all the time. So it's okay to do that sometimes, like on an occasion where, again, you need it to ferment fast, but I wouldn't recommend doing that every single time you feed your starter. I typically like to do a 1:2:2 ratio. And again, that's just double the amount of flour and double the amount of water compared to the amount of starter. And the reason I like to do that is because it's kind of a happy medium for me. I live in a very warm climate, so a lot of times my starter does not take very long to ferment because, again, remember, warmer temperatures, faster fermentation. Also, smaller feeding ratios, faster fermentation. So for me, if I combine that warm environment plus the smaller ratio, my starter is going to ferment very quickly. Probably so quickly that I won't get to it in time to prep my dough before it starts to deflate. So I like that 1:2:2 ratio because it's a happy medium. It ensures that my starter is not going to ferment very quick, and it's also not going to take a really long time to ferment. So opposite of the smaller feeding ratio, obviously a higher feeding ratio is going to take a lot longer. So for example, if I did a 1:4:4 ratio and I fed again with that 25 grams of starter and fed it 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, all those little hungry people are going to be very hungry, but it's going to take them a lot longer to get through all that food. So it's going to, rise at a much slower pace. So that can be used to your advantage if, say, you feed your starter at night and it's a warm night in the summer. You know that you have, your full 8 hours for it to ferment, which I don't know who actually gets a full 8 hours of sleep, but lucky you if you do. But you'll know that you have all night for it to ferment, and so you can feed it that higher ratio to make sure that it ferments overnight and is still, at peak, or at least almost at peak in the morning when you're ready to prep your dough. So that is a really nice tool to have in the summer, especially, in the warmer months. And I also like to feed my starter that higher ratio because I do think that it is healthy for your starter to kind of have that slow fermentation because it's not going to create that acid buildup in your starter. So again, completely okay to do the 1:1:1 ratio sometimes. I personally do not like to do that all the time. Some bakers might argue with me that it's totally okay to do the 1:1:1, but I've done it before and I have noticed that it kind of changes the flavor of my bread and the smell of my starter, and it just doesn't seem to be as healthy when I continually do that 1:1:1 ratio. So you can play around with feeding ratios. I play around with it all the time. Like I said, last night I did a 1:4:4 ratio because it was a colder night and I fed it pretty early in the night. It was 8 p.m. and I knew that I didn't want to prep my dough super early in the morning. I kind of wanted to do it mid-morning. So I, did that ratio and look at my starter. It's this was at 7 and it's still rising. So I know that it's not quite at peak. And so now I know in the next couple hours it'll be ready and I can make my bread. I know that that sounds like a lot, but I recommend just, again, trying to imagine those little tiny people that are really hungry. That's your starter. So that's that first number in your starter feeding ratio. And then the more food you give them, increasing your ratio is going to cause a slower fermentation. Lowering your ratio, less food, is just going to decrease that fermentation time. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, I have a free sourdough starter guide, which includes, a lot of information about feeding ratios and how to maintain your starter, how to keep it healthy, active, thriving. If you want to skip creating your own sourdough starter, maybe it feels super daunting to you, I also offer dehydrated sourdough starter, beloved row here on my website. I can link the free starter guide as well as my dehydrated starter below, so you can check those out. And as always, please feel free to reach out with any questions. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you. Have fun. Don't get overwhelmed, intimidated. Check back here for my next video, which is going to be on bulk fermentation. And I'm going to kind of walk you through how to watch for signs for that. And as always, thank you so much for being here.